Rebecca Miller was 38 years old, a corporate attorney from Chicago, and 3 months ago, her husband's 24-year-old assistant called her sobbing, saying he told me, "You knew about us." Rebecca didn't know anything, but in that split second, she made a decision that would destroy him completely. What she said next set off a chain of events that cost him his career, his reputation, $2.3 million, and his freedom. And she didn't feel guilty for 1 second. She had no idea her husband was having an affair. None. But when that girl called her crying, thinking she was some cool wife who'd given her blessing, something clicked. Rebecca realized she had the upper hand. The assistant thought she knew, which meant she could play along and gather every single piece of evidence she needed before he even realized she'd found out. What she did in the next 72 hours was calculated, cold, and absolutely devastating. Before diving into exactly how she took down a man who thought he was untouchable, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Drop your location in the comments. This story gets dark, it gets messy, but justice is so sweet. Let's take you back to the beginning, to when Rebecca thought she'd married her soulmate. Rebecca met David Miller 7 years ago at a legal conference in Boston. She was 31, a rising associate at a major law firm specializing in corporate litigation. He was 35, a successful investment banker with Morgan Stanley, giving a presentation on financial risk management. She remembered sitting in that conference room, taking notes, when he made this joke about derivatives that was actually funny, rare for finance guys. After his panel, she approached him to ask a follow-up question about fiduciary responsibility, and he looked at her like she was the most fascinating person he'd ever met. Finally, he said, grinning, "Someone who actually understands what I do." They ended up talking for 2 hours at the hotel bar. He told her about growing up in Connecticut, his MBA from Wharton, his dreams of starting his own investment fund someday. She told him about her childhood in Michigan, her parents, who were both teachers, how she'd worked her way through law school waiting tables. He seemed genuinely impressed, not intimidated like so many men were by successful women. They exchanged numbers, and even though he lived in New York and she was in Chicago, they started this intense, long-distance relationship. He'd fly to Chicago every other weekend. She'd take the train to New York when she could. They'd video chat every night, sometimes for hours. He'd text her good morning before she woke up, send her flowers at work with notes that said things like, "Can't stop thinking about that brilliant argument you made about contract law." He made her feel seen, valued, intellectually respected. 6 months in, David told her he loved her. They were walking through Central Park. It was October. Leaves were changing colors, and he just stopped, turned to her, and said, "Rebecca, I've dated a lot of women, but you're different. You challenge me. You make me want to be better." She fell hard. Looking back now, she could see he knew exactly what to say, exactly how to present himself. But at the time, she thought she'd won the lottery. After a year of long distance, David got transferred to Morgan Stanley's Chicago office. It felt like fate. He moved into her apartment in Lincoln Park, and suddenly they were playing house. They'd cook elaborate meals together on weekends. He made this incredible cocoa van, and they'd debate cases and market trends over wine. Her friends loved him. Her parents adored him. When they visited Michigan for Thanksgiving, her mother pulled her aside and said, "Rebecca, honey, don't let this one get away." David proposed on their 2-year anniversary. He took her back to Boston to that same hotel where they'd met, recreated their first date down to the specific table at the bar. He'd even coordinated with the hotel to serve the same wine they'd ordered that first night. When he got down on one knee and pulled out this stunning emerald-cut diamond, "Emerald for my brilliant lawyer," he said, she cried. She actually cried. She said yes before he even finished asking. The wedding was perfect. They got married at the Four Seasons in Chicago, 200 guests, ceremony overlooking the lake. She wore Vera Wang. David wore Tom Ford. Her father walked her down the aisle crying, and when David saw her, he had tears streaming down his face too. During their vows, he promised to support her ambitions, challenge her intellect, and love her unconditionally. She promised to be his partner in success and struggle, in ambition and rest. They meant those words. At least she did. Their honeymoon in the Maldives was straight out of a romance novel. Overwater bungalow, private beach, swimming with sea turtles, making love under the stars. David would wake her up with coffee and say, "Good morning, Mrs. Miller. How did I get so lucky?" They'd spend hours just talking about their future, where they'd live, what kind of house they'd buy, how they'd balance two demanding careers, whether they wanted kids. The first 2 years of marriage were genuinely happy. They bought a stunning townhouse in Gold Coast, 4 bedrooms, rooftop deck, walking distance to her firm. David made partner at Morgan Stanley. She made senior associate. They were that power couple everyone envied. They'd host dinner parties where David would proudly introduce her as my wife, the brilliant attorney who just won a $40 million settlement. He'd brag about her accomplishments to his colleagues. He seemed so proud of her. They'd take long weekend trips, Napa Valley for wine tasting, Aspen for skiing, New York for Broadway shows. They maintained date nights, even with their insane schedules. Every Thursday, no matter what, they'd go to dinner. Just the two of them, phones off, completely present. David would hold her hand across the table and say this, right here. This is what matters. Not the deals, not the cases, us. She thought she'd found forever. She thought she'd married a man who valued partnership, who respected ambition, who understood that love and career success weren't mutually exclusive. She thought she knew him. She had no idea who he really was. The first change was subtle. About 2.5 years into their marriage, David hired a new assistant at his office. Her name was Madison Pierce, 24 years old, fresh out of some small college in Ohio with a business degree. He mentioned it casually over dinner one night. "Finally got approval to hire an assistant," he said. "This young woman, Madison, really impressed me in the interview. Sharp, eager, willing to work long hours. Rebecca didn't think anything of it. Investment bankers need assistants. She had a paralegal. Normal professional stuff." But then he started mentioning her more. Madison pulled together this incredible presentation. Madison caught an error in a contract that could have cost us millions. Madison stayed until midnight helping me prepare for tomorrow's meeting. Always Madison this, Madison that. She noticed, but she rationalized it. Madison was his assistant. Of course they worked closely together. Of course she was on his mind. Rebecca was secure in their marriage. She trusted him. Then came the late nights. David had always worked hard, but suddenly he was coming home at 10 p.m., 11 p.m., sometimes midnight. "Big deal closing," he'd say, kissing her forehead. "You know how it is." And she did know. She worked late too. So she'd heat up dinner. They'd eat together, and she'd push down the little voice that wondered why he needed his assistant there so late too. The business trips increased. Need to go to New York for a week. Client meeting in San Francisco. Have to be in Boston for this deal. She'd ask if she should come visit if it coincided with a weekend, and he'd say, "Nah, baby, I'll be working the whole time. Not worth you flying out." That should have been a red flag. Before, he'd always wanted her to join him when possible. They'd make mini vacations out of work trips. But she told herself he was being considerate of her schedule. About 6 months after Madison started, Rebecca noticed David on his phone constantly, texting during dinner, even during their sacred Thursday date nights. "Sorry, work emergency," he'd say. But he'd smile at his phone sometimes, this little smirk, before typing back. When she'd ask what was so urgent, he'd say just Madison asking about tomorrow's schedule, or Madison had a question about a client file. Always a reasonable explanation. Then their sex life changed. They'd gone from making love 3-4 times a week to maybe once every 2 weeks. When she'd initiate, he'd say he was exhausted, or he'd perform but seemed distant, mechanical. One night, he actually called out the wrong name. Not Madison's name, thank God, just a random Sarah. He claimed it was a client's name. He was stressed about a deal. She chose to believe him. Her friends started noticing. They had dinner with another couple, Rachel and Tom, both corporate attorneys like Rebecca, and afterward, Rachel pulled her aside. "Is everything okay with you and David?" she asked. He was on his phone the entire dinner. Rebecca defended him. "Big deal, you know how it is." But Rachel pressed. "Rebecca, I've known you for 10 years. You seem tired, stressed. Is he pulling his weight at home?" She laughed it off, but Rachel's words stuck with her. Her mother noticed too during a visit. They were having coffee while David was supposedly at the office on a Saturday, another new thing, weekend work, and she said, "Honey, you seem lonely." That word, lonely, hit her hard. She was married, living with someone. How could she be lonely? But her mother was right. David was physically present, less and less, and emotionally present even when he was home. Rebecca started paying more attention. His phone had suddenly acquired a passcode when it never had one before. "Security for work stuff," he explained. His computer screen would snap shut if she walked into his home office. "Client confidentiality," he'd say. He'd take calls in his car in the garage, coming back in saying had to deal with something. Once she came home early from work and heard him laughing in his office. Really laughing, in a way he hadn't laughed with her in months. When she walked in, he quickly said, "I'll call you back," and hung up. "Who was that?" she asked. "Madison, just something funny that happened with a client." Always an explanation. Always Madison. The real warning came from David's mother, of all people. Sarah Miller and Rebecca had a complicated relationship. She was old money Connecticut. Rebecca was middle-class Michigan, but she called Rebecca one day and asked to have lunch. Just them. Over salads at some fancy restaurant, she said, "Rebecca, I'm going to be direct. David has been acting strangely, secretive. I've seen this before with his father. David's father had cheated on Sarah for years before they divorced. I'm not saying David is doing what his father did, but watch him, dear. These Miller men, they're charming, but they think they're untouchable." Rebecca told her she was being paranoid. She told herself Sarah was projecting her own marriage trauma onto hers. But deep down, alarm bells were ringing. Still, she didn't want to be that wife, the suspicious, jealous one. She'd always prided herself on being rational, trusting, secure. So she pushed the doubt away. She kept hoping things would go back to normal. She suggested they see a marriage counselor, just for a tune-up. David said, "We don't need therapy, we're fine. I'm just stressed with work. Once this deal closes, everything will settle down." She clung to that promise. Once this deal closes, she thought, once this project ends, once things slow down at the office. But things never slowed down. The distance kept growing, and she kept making excuses. The first major incident happened on their 4th wedding anniversary. Rebecca had made reservations at a Linnea, one of the best restaurants in Chicago, months in advance. She'd blocked off the entire evening, turned off her work phone, bought a new dress. She was determined to reconnect with her husband. David came home at 7:30 p.m. They had an 8 p.m. reservation. He looked stressed, distracted. "Baby, I'm so sorry," he said, not even kissing her hello. "Crisis at work. I need to go back to the office." She stared at him in disbelief. "David, it's our anniversary. I made reservations 4 months ago." He ran his hand through his hair, frustrated. "I know, and I feel terrible, but this deal is falling apart. Madison and I have been working on damage control all day. I need to be there." "Then let Madison handle it," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "She's your assistant. That's what assistants are for." "She can't handle this alone," he snapped. "This is a $500 million deal, Rebecca. I can't just leave her to manage it." They argued. She cried. He kept checking his phone while she was crying. Finally, he said, "Fine. We'll go to dinner. I'll put my phone away. You're right." But at the restaurant, he lasted 20 minutes before "I'm so sorry, I have to take this," and stepping outside. He was gone for 30 minutes. When he came back, he said, "We need to go. Now. The deal is imploding." They left. He dropped her off at home and went back to the office. At midnight, she called him. Madison answered his phone. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Miller. David's in the bathroom. We're just wrapping up." She sounded so chipper, so casual, like it was completely normal to be alone with Rebecca's husband at midnight on their anniversary. The second incident was worse. It was February, cold as hell in Chicago, and Rebecca came down with the flu. High fever, body aches, couldn't get out of bed. She texted David, "Really sick. Can you come home?" He responded, "In a meeting. Take some Tylenol. Be home tonight." She spent the day alone, shivering, dragging herself to the kitchen for water. Her mother offered to drive up from Michigan, but she said no. Her husband would take care of her. David came home at 11 p.m. She was barely conscious with fever. "Hey, baby," he said, kissing her burning forehead. "You okay?" She mumbled something about needing him. "I'm here now," he said, but then his phone rang. He stepped out of the bedroom. She heard him say, "Madison, slow down. Okay, I'll log in from home." "No, it's fine. Yeah, she's sick, but she's asleep. Okay, give me 20 minutes. He came back in. "I need to handle something from my office. Go back to sleep." She was too sick to argue. The next morning, she woke up to an empty bed. She found him passed out on the couch in his home office, his laptop open to a shared document with Madison's edit comments all over it. They'd worked together remotely all night while she was sick and alone. When she confronted him about it that afternoon, he got angry. "What do you want from me, Rebecca?" "I have responsibilities. You're a lawyer, you understand work demands. Why are you being so clingy all of a sudden?" Clingy. He'd never used that word about her before. She stood there in her pajamas, still feverish, and felt something inside her crack. The psychological manipulation became more obvious after that. He started making her question her own perceptions. When she'd say, "You spend more time with Madison than with me," he'd respond, "That's because I spend 40 hours a week at work and only evenings and weekends at home. It's not about preference, it's about math." When she'd say, "You seem emotionally distant," he'd say, "You're projecting. You're the one who's always at the office late. Maybe you're feeling guilty about your own work obsession." He'd twist everything, make her feel like she was the problem, like she was being unreasonable. He started criticizing her more. "You used to be fun," he'd say. "Now you're always questioning me, always suspicious. Or you've let yourself go a little, haven't you? When was the last time you went to the gym?" She was a size 6, same as when they met, but he'd plant these seeds of doubt about her appearance, her personality, her worth. The third major incident happened in April. They were supposed to go to a charity gala together, something important for her firm. She'd mentioned it for weeks. The day of the event, David texted her 2 hours before. "Can't make it. Emergency in New York. Flying out now." She called him livid. "David, this is a firm event. Partners will be there. You're making me look bad." He sighed, exasperated. "Rebecca, I have a job. I can't just blow off clients because you need arm candy for a party." "It's not arm candy," she said, her voice shaking. "It's my career. You used to support my career." "I do support it," he said coldly. "I just can't be at your beck and call every time you need something. Figure it out." He hung up. She went to the gala alone, wearing a forced smile, lying to everyone who asked where her husband was. "Work emergency," she'd say brightly, dying inside. Her senior partner, Harold, pulled her aside during cocktail hour. "Rebecca, is everything all right at home?" She must have looked as devastated as she felt. "Fine," she lied. "Just the usual work-life balance struggles." But Harold looked at her with pity, and she hated it. That night, she couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m., she did something she'd never done before. She logged into their cell phone account online and pulled up David's call logs. Her hands were shaking. She told herself she was being crazy, but she couldn't stop. The data loaded. Her heart stopped. In the past month alone, David had called or texted Madison 847 times. 847 times. There were calls at 6 a.m., midnight, 2 a.m., calls lasting 2 hours, texts sent every few minutes. She scrolled through, numb with shock. Meanwhile, he'd called her maybe 30 times that month, most of them quick on my way home check-ins. She sat in their bedroom, in the house they'd bought together, wearing the pajamas he'd bought her for Christmas, and she felt herself disappearing. The woman she'd been, confident, successful, secure, was fading. In her place was someone she didn't recognize, anxious, suspicious, constantly scanning for the next betrayal. But she still didn't have proof. Call logs weren't evidence of an affair. They worked together. They had legitimate reasons to communicate constantly. She was a lawyer. She knew she needed more than suspicion. So she said nothing. She swallowed her fear and kept watching. In May, David started coming home smelling different. Not like another woman's perfume. He was too smart for that, but he'd smell like expensive restaurants she knew he hadn't been to for work, like hotel soap. Once he came home with a hickey on his collarbone. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked in the mirror, unfazed. "Oh, must have happened at the gym. You know how the equipment can pinch your skin." It was the most insulting lie he'd told her yet. Gym equipment doesn't leave hickeys. But he looked her straight in the eye and sold that lie like it was truth. If this story is resonating with you, if you've ever felt this kind of betrayal creeping up on you, please hit that like button and subscribe. Your support means everything, and there's an ending to this story that makes all the pain worth it. The isolation was the worst part. David systematically cut her off from her support system. When she'd want to have dinner with friends, he'd pick a fight beforehand so she'd be too upset to go. When her parents wanted to visit, he'd schedule work trips so he wouldn't be there, making it awkward. He'd make subtle comments about her friends. "Rachel seems jealous of our relationship," he'd say. "Maybe she's not the best person to talk to about our marriage." He'd poison every potential source of support, leaving her increasingly alone. By June, Rebecca was a shell of herself. She'd lost weight, not because she was trying, but because she couldn't eat. She'd lie awake next to him at night, knowing he was lying to her but unable to prove it, feeling like she was losing her mind. Partners at her firm started commenting on her distracted work. She'd missed deadlines, something she'd never done before. Her entire life was collapsing, and David would come home, kiss her absently, and act like everything was normal. The worst moment came in early July, 3 months before that phone call that would change everything. Rebecca had just finished a brutal deposition that lasted 9 hours. She was exhausted, drained, barely holding it together. She came home at 8 p.m., hoping David might be there, hoping they could just sit together and she could feel less alone. The house was empty. She called. Him. No answer. She texted. No response. At 10 p.m., she was sitting in the dark living room, staring at nothing, when her phone rang. It was David. "Hey," he said casually. "What's up?" "Where are you?" she asked, her voice hollow. "At a client dinner, running late, probably be home around midnight." She could hear music in the background, laughter, clinking glasses. It sounded like a party, not a business dinner. "Who are you with?" she asked. "The team," he said vaguely. "Listen, I gotta go. We're about to order." He hung up before she could respond. She sat there for another hour, spiraling. Then she did something desperate. She called David's office line, the one that went to his assistant's desk. Madison answered. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Miller," she said, her voice sugary sweet. "David's not here. He left around 6. Can I take a message?" Rebecca's blood went cold. He said he was at a client dinner. "Oh," Madison said, and there was this pause, this loaded silence. Yeah, he must have meant a personal client thing. I'm not sure of his evening schedule. She was lying. Rebecca could hear it in her voice. The pity, the knowledge, the discomfort of being caught in the middle. That night, when David came home at 1 a.m., smelling like wine and perfume he claimed was from a female client, hugging him goodbye, Rebecca didn't say anything. She just watched him. She watched him undress, watched him brush his teeth, watched him slide into bed next to her and fall asleep within minutes, completely untroubled. And she made a decision. She was done being the victim. She was done questioning herself. She was done giving him the benefit of the doubt. She was going to find proof, and she was going to destroy him. The next morning, Rebecca called in sick to work. She'd never done that unless she was genuinely ill, but she needed time to think, to plan. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and started researching. Private investigators, surveillance technology, digital forensics. She spent 8 hours reading about how to catch a cheating spouse, taking notes like she was preparing for trial. And in a way, she was. She was building a case. By the end of the day, she'd hired a private investigator named Marcus Chen, a former FBI agent who specialized in infidelity cases. She transferred $5,000 to his account. She gave him David's information, Madison's information, everything she knew. "Find me proof," she said. "I need photographs, recordings, documentation. I need evidence that would hold up in court." Marcus assured her that if there was something to find, he'd find it. For the next 6 weeks, Rebecca lived a double life. On the surface, she was the same as always. She went to work, she came home, she cooked dinner, she slept next to David, she pretended everything was fine. But underneath, she was watching everything. She noted every late night, every suspicious text, every lie. She kept a detailed log with dates, times, and descriptions. She took screenshots of phone records. She documented everything, and she waited for Marcus to deliver. David had no idea she was onto him. He continued his affair, or whatever it was, with complete confidence. He'd come home and tell her about his day, leaving out the hours he spent with Madison, and she'd nod and smile and ask follow-up questions. She was playing him the same way he'd played her, and it felt like power returning to her body after months of feeling powerless. Marcus called her in late August. "I've got something," he said. "Can you meet me?" They met at a coffee shop in a neighborhood where no one would recognize her. Marcus slid a manila envelope across the table. Rebecca's hand shook as she opened it. Inside were photographs. David and Madison at a restaurant holding hands across the table. David and Madison going into a hotel together at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. David and Madison kissing in his car in the parking garage at his office. David with his hand on her lower back, intimate, possessive. Madison wearing a necklace that Rebecca recognized, one David had told her he bought for a client's wife. There were dozens of photos taken over the past month. Clear, undeniable proof. But Marcus wasn't done. He pulled out his phone and played her an audio recording. He'd placed a small listening device in David's car, completely legal since Rebecca co-owned the vehicle. The recording was from 3 days ago. David and Madison were in the car, clearly after having sex somewhere, laughing and talking. She heard Madison say, "Does she really not know about us?" And David responded, "Rebecca? No, she's clueless. She's so wrapped up in her own work, she barely notices what I do. Plus, she's so desperate to believe we're fine that she'll rationalize anything." Madison laughed. "Don't you feel bad?" David's response made Rebecca's blood freeze. "Feel bad? Madison, I stopped feeling anything for her years ago. She's like a roommate I'm legally obligated to live with. You're what I want. This is what I want." Rebecca stopped the recording. She'd heard enough. She paid Marcus another $3,000 for copies of everything, including the audio files, and walked out of that coffee shop a different person. She went home, poured herself a large glass of wine, and sat in her study looking at those photographs. David, the man she'd loved, the man she'd built a life with, who'd promised to cherish her, was in love with someone else. Had been for probably over a year, and he thought she was too stupid, too desperate, too pathetic to figure it out. The humiliation was crushing, but underneath the humiliation was rage, white-hot, clarifying rage. He'd stolen years of her life. He'd made her question her sanity. He'd isolated her from her friends and family. He'd degraded her, manipulated her, lied to her every single day, and he thought he was going to get away with it. That night, Rebecca started planning. She wasn't going to just divorce David. She was going to make sure he lost everything. First, she called her friend Michael, a forensic accountant she'd worked with on cases. She needed him to go through David's financials with a microscope. She suspected David was hiding money, maybe even using company funds to finance his affair. Michael agreed to help, no questions asked. Next, she compiled all the evidence Marcus had gathered and made multiple copies, storing them in different locations. Cloud storage, a safe deposit box at a bank David didn't know about, with her best friend Rachel. She wasn't taking any chances. Then she started documenting their marital assets. Every bank account, every investment, the house, their cars, her jewelry, everything. She photographed everything in the house. She made copies of every financial document she could find. She was building a fortress, and David had no idea the walls were closing in. But Rebecca had one more card to play, and it was her secret weapon. She had a cousin, Jessica, who worked in HR at Morgan Stanley. They weren't close, but they'd always gotten along. Rebecca called Jessica and asked to meet for lunch. Over sushi, Rebecca laid it all out. David was having an affair with his assistant. She had proof. She knew Morgan Stanley had strict policies about relationships between superiors and subordinates. Jessica's face went pale. "Rebecca," she said, "if what you're saying is true, David could lose his job." "That's exactly what I want," Rebecca said calmly. She showed Jessica one photograph, just one, of David and Madison at that restaurant. Jessica nodded slowly. "I need to report this to compliance," she said, "but I have to follow protocol. Give me a week." Rebecca agreed. Everything was falling into place. For the next week, Rebecca went through the motions. She was pleasant to David, even affectionate. She asked about his day. She suggested they have a date night. David seemed relieved, like he thought whatever tension had existed between them was resolved. "You seem happier," he said one night. "I am," she lied. "I think I was just stressed about work, but I'm feeling more balanced now." He kissed her forehead. "I'm glad," he said. "I hate when you're upset." The audacity of him, lying to her face while comforting her about stress he'd caused, was almost impressive. Then came October 3rd, the day that changed everything. Rebecca was at work when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up, and she heard Madison's voice choked with tears, barely coherent. "Mrs. Miller," Madison said, and the use of her formal name was jarring. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. He told me you knew about us. He said you had an arrangement, that you were okay with it. I swear, I thought you knew." Rebecca's heart was pounding, but her voice was steady. "Slow down, Madison. What are you talking about?" Madison sobbed. "David and me. Our relationship. He said you knew, that you'd agreed to an open marriage. But I just talked to HR at Morgan Stanley, and they said there's an investigation, and I realized he lied to me. You didn't know. Oh my God, you didn't know." She dissolved into hysterical crying. Rebecca sat at her desk in her corner office overlooking Lake Michigan and felt everything click into place. This was it. This was her moment. She took a deep breath and made a choice that would define everything that came next. "Madison," she said, her voice warm, almost kind. "Honey, it's okay. I did know. David told you the truth. We do have an arrangement." Rebecca heard Madison's crying stutter to a stop. "What?" Madison said, confused. "You knew?" "Yes," Rebecca lied smoothly. "David and I have been in an open marriage for 2 years. I have my own partners. It works for us. The problem is, Madison, it sounds like David didn't follow the rules we set. We agreed any outside relationships would be kept completely separate from work. By having an affair with his assistant, he violated company policy and put both of your jobs at risk. That's what I'm upset about, not the relationship itself." There was a long silence. Madison's voice, when she spoke again, was tentative, hopeful. "So you're not angry about us? About the relationship?" Rebecca could hear the desperation in her voice, the need to believe she wasn't a homewrecker, that she hadn't destroyed a marriage. "No, sweetheart," Rebecca said. "I'm not angry about the relationship, but I do need to understand the full scope of what happened. Can you tell me everything? When it started, where you've met, any texts or gifts he's given you? I need to know what evidence might exist for this HR investigation. I want to protect both of you if I can. And Madison, that naive, trusting, stupid girl, told her everything. She told Rebecca that the affair started 11 months ago at a work conference in Miami. She told her about the hotel rooms David had booked, always paying cash so there wouldn't be a trail. She told her about the necklace, the bracelet, the expensive dinners. She told her that David had said he was going to leave Rebecca eventually, that he just needed to wait for the right time. She told her that they'd had sex in his office after hours at least 20 times. She told her that David had used company funds to pay for some of their trips, disguising them as client entertainment. She told Rebecca everything, thinking she was helping, thinking this understanding wife was going to save them both. Rebecca took notes. She recorded the call. Madison had no idea. When Madison finally wound down, still sniffling, Rebecca said, "Thank you for being honest with me. I know this is hard. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to call David and tell him we need to have a conversation tonight about how to handle this HR situation. I'm going to advise both of you to cooperate fully with the investigation and be completely honest. The truth will protect you. Do you understand?" Madison agreed eagerly. She thanked Rebecca, actually thanked her, for being so cool about everything. When Rebecca hung up, she sat in her office for a full 5 minutes staring at the lake, feeling something like joy for the first time in months. She immediately called Michael, her forensic accountant friend. "I need you to look into something," she said. "David Miller, Morgan Stanley, any irregularities in expense reports over the past year, particularly anything that could be classified as misappropriation of company funds for personal use." Michael said he'd need access. Rebecca told him that Jessica at HR was opening an investigation and would likely request his services as an external consultant. It was all legal, all above board, all devastating. Next, she called her attorney, a shark named Patricia Hernandez, who specialized in high-asset divorces. "I'm ready to file," Rebecca said, "and I have everything we need." That evening, Rebecca went home and cooked dinner. Salmon, David's favorite, with roasted vegetables and a nice white wine. She set the table beautifully. She put on music. When David came home at 7:30, surprisingly early, he looked confused. "What's all this?" "Felt like cooking," she said lightly. "Plus, I thought we should talk." His face closed off immediately. "Talk about what?" Rebecca smiled. "David, honey, I got an interesting phone call today from Madison." His face went white. "She told me everything. She thought I already knew. She thought we had an open marriage. Can you imagine?" David just stared at her, frozen. Rebecca continued, her voice cheerful, almost amused. "So I'm curious, David. When exactly were you planning to tell me you've been fucking your 24-year-old assistant for almost a year? When were you going to mention that you've been using company money to take her on romantic getaways? When were you going to explain why you told her I knew about your affair and had given my blessing?" She took a sip of wine, watching him squirm. "Because here's what's fascinating to me. You thought I was too stupid to figure it out. You thought I was so desperate to keep our marriage intact that I'd ignore every red flag, every lie, every betrayal. And honestly, David, I did ignore them for a while, but not anymore." David tried to speak. "Rebecca, I can explain." She held up her hand. "No, you really can't. I have photographs of you two together. I have audio recordings of you talking about me, about how clueless I am, about how you stopped loving me years ago. I have testimony from Madison detailing every aspect of your affair, including the misuse of company funds. I have a forensic accountant going through your financials. I have an HR investigation at Morgan Stanley that's going to cost you your job. And I have a divorce attorney who's going to make sure you lose everything else." David's shock turned to anger. "You set me up," he said. "You manipulated Madison. You recorded me without my consent." Rebecca laughed. "I recorded you in a car I co-own, which is completely legal. I didn't manipulate Madison. I simply allowed her to believe I already knew what she was confirming. And as for setting you up, David, you set yourself up the moment you decided to cheat on your wife with your subordinate and lie about it for a year. I just documented it." The fight that followed was brutal. David tried everything. He apologized, he cried, he begged. When that didn't work, he got mean. He said she was a frigid bitch, that he'd only cheated because she was so cold, so focused on her career that she neglected him. He said Madison made him feel alive in a way Rebecca never had. He said if she went through with this, she'd regret it. He had powerful friends. He'd make sure she paid. Rebecca listened to all of it calmly. When he was done, she said, "I want you out of this house by tomorrow. You can stay at a hotel. In fact, I'd suggest the Ritz-Carlton. That's where you took Madison last month, right? You'll feel right at home." David left that night, slamming the door so hard a picture frame fell off the wall. The next morning, Rebecca filed for divorce. She included every piece of evidence in her filing: the photographs, the recordings, Madison's testimony, the financial irregularities. She requested full ownership of their townhouse, half of all marital assets plus additional damages for emotional distress, and she wanted David to cover all legal fees. Her attorney, Patricia, smiled when she reviewed the filing. "This is airtight," she said. "He's going to lose big." At the same time, Jessica called to inform Rebecca that Morgan Stanley's investigation had confirmed David's inappropriate relationship with a subordinate and misuse of company funds. He was being terminated effective immediately. His partnership was revoked, and he was being required to repay $68,000 in misappropriated funds. Madison was being transferred to another department with a formal reprimand in her file. But Rebecca wasn't done. She called David's mother, Sarah, and told her everything. Sarah was horrified. "I warned you," she said. "I told you to watch him. I'm so sorry, Rebecca. I'm on your side. Whatever you need." She also called David's boss, his mentor at Morgan Stanley, a man named Richard who'd always been kind to her. "Richard," she said, "I thought you should know that David's termination wasn't just about an affair. He used company money to fund it. He put Morgan Stanley at legal risk. I have all the documentation if the company wants it for their files." Richard thanked her. Morgan Stanley, he assured her, would not be giving David any references. His career in finance was effectively over. Word spread quickly in their social circle. Rebecca didn't have to say anything. People talked. Suddenly, friends who'd always fawned over David were calling Rebecca to offer support. Dinner invitations dried up for David but increased for Rebecca. At a party she attended alone, her friend Rachel pulled her aside. "I'm so proud of you," she said. "You could have just quietly divorced him. Instead, you made sure he faced real consequences. That takes courage." Rebecca smiled. "He thought I was weak," she said. "He thought I'd just accept it and move on. He was wrong." The divorce took 3 months to finalize. During that time, David tried multiple times to negotiate, to reduce what he'd have to pay, to keep the townhouse. Patricia shot down every attempt. "Your client," she told his attorney, "committed adultery, misappropriated funds, and caused significant emotional harm to my client. We're not negotiating." In the end, David lost everything. The court awarded Rebecca the townhouse, valued at $1.8 million. She got half of all their investments and savings, plus an additional $500,000 in damages. David was required to pay her legal fees, another $80,000. In total, Rebecca walked away with over $2.3 million in assets and cash. David left with his personal belongings, his car, and a destroyed reputation. But the best part, Morgan Stanley blacklisted him. No major financial firm would hire him after what he'd done. He ended up taking a job at a small regional bank in Cleveland at a quarter of his previous salary. Madison, that poor stupid girl who thought she was getting a successful older man, realized David had just been using her. She quit Morgan Stanley 3 months after the scandal and moved back to Ohio. Rebecca heard through the grapevine that she'd told people David had promised her everything and delivered nothing, that he'd lied to her just like he'd lied to his wife. There was no happy ending for the affair, no romantic sunset, just 2 people who'd blown up their lives for nothing. If you've made it this far in the story, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like this, stories of justice and survival, they matter. Drop a comment and let me know what you think Rebecca should do next. As for Rebecca herself, the months after the divorce were a revelation. She realized how much of herself she'd lost during those years with David, how small she'd made herself to accommodate his ego, his lies, his betrayals. She started therapy, working through the trauma of being gaslit and manipulated for so long. She reconnected with friends she'd drifted away from. She took a trip to Italy by herself, something she'd always wanted to do. She spent 2 weeks in Tuscany, drinking wine, eating incredible food, and remembering who she was before David Miller. She also threw herself back into her work with renewed focus. Without the constant anxiety of her failing marriage, she was sharper, more effective. She won 2 major cases in the 6 months after her divorce. Her firm made her a junior partner, something she'd been working toward for years. At the celebration dinner, her senior partner Harold raised a glass to her. To Rebecca, he said, a brilliant attorney and a force of nature. Everyone clapped, and she felt genuinely happy for the first time in years. A year after the divorce was finalized, Rebecca was thriving. She'd redecorated the townhouse, erasing every trace of David. She'd started dating again, nothing serious, just enjoying meeting new people without the weight of betrayal hanging over her. She'd rebuilt her relationship with her parents, who visited often and marveled at how much lighter she seemed. "You're yourself again," her mother said, hugging her. "We missed you." One evening, Rebecca was having dinner with her friend Rachel, and their conversation turned to David. "Have you heard anything about him lately?" Rachel asked. Rebecca shook her head. "Honestly, I don't care. He's a chapter I've closed." But Rachel had heard something through their network. Apparently, David had tried to start his own consulting firm, and it failed within 6 months. He'd burned too many bridges. His reputation was too damaged. He was apparently living in a small apartment in Cleveland, working a job he hated, still paying off debts from the divorce settlement. And Madison? She'd gotten engaged to someone else, a guy her own age from her hometown. She'd never mentioned David in her engagement announcement. Rebecca felt nothing hearing this. Not satisfaction, not sympathy, nothing. She'd gotten her justice. She'd taken back her power. What David did with the ruins of his life was no longer her concern. She'd moved on in every way that mattered. That night, lying in bed in her beautiful townhouse, in the room she'd redesigned to reflect her taste alone, Rebecca thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal had nearly destroyed her. The gaslighting had made her question her own reality. The isolation had left her feeling utterly alone. But she'd survived. More than survived. She'd won. Looking back now, she could see the warning signs she'd missed, the moments when she could have confronted him earlier, but she also recognized that she'd needed to gather evidence, to build an airtight case, to ensure that when she struck, it would be devastating and final. If she'd confronted David the moment she first suspected something, he could have denied it, covered his tracks, painted her as paranoid. Instead, she'd waited, watched, documented everything, and struck when she had irrefutable proof. It was the lawyer in her, the strategic thinker, and it had worked perfectly. The lesson, if there was one, was this: trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, it usually is. But more than that, know your worth. Rebecca had spent too long accepting less than she deserved, making excuses for unacceptable behavior, shrinking herself to fit into a relationship that was killing her. Never again. She'd learned that she was stronger than she knew, more capable than she'd realized, and deserving of a partner who valued her. David hadn't been that partner, but someday, someone would be. For now, though, Rebecca was content being alone. She had her career, her friends, her family, her beautiful home. She had peace, something she hadn't felt in years, and she had the satisfaction of knowing that a man who'd thought he could betray her with impunity had lost everything. He'd underestimated her, dismissed her, manipulated her, and she'd made him pay for every single moment of it. 3 months after that reflection, Rebecca got an unexpected email. It was from a woman named Jennifer, someone she didn't know. The email said, "I heard about what happened with your ex-husband through a mutual friend. I'm in a similar situation, and I don't know what to do. Would you be willing to talk?" Rebecca thought about it for a long time. Part of her wanted to leave that pain behind, to never think about David or betrayal or any of it again. But another part of her, the part that had survived and fought back, wanted to help. She wrote back, "Yes, let's meet for coffee." Over the next year, Rebecca quietly became a resource for women going through similar situations. She'd meet them for coffee, share her story, explain how she'd gathered evidence, offer advice on attorneys and strategies. She didn't charge anything. She just wanted to help women who felt as powerless as she once had. Some of them took her advice and fought back. Others decided to take different paths. But all of them told her the same thing. "Thank you for showing me I'm not alone. Thank you for showing me I'm strong enough to survive this." Rebecca never spoke to David again after the divorce was finalized. She heard through the grapevine that he'd tried to reach out once, wanting to apologize, wanting closure. She ignored it. She owed him nothing, not even a conversation. Her closure had come when the judge signed the divorce decree, when the money hit her bank account, when she'd changed the locks on the townhouse and slept peacefully for the first time in years. That was her closure. She didn't need his apology. She didn't need his explanation. She'd moved on, and he no longer mattered. The story of Rebecca Miller and David Miller became something of a legend in their social and professional circles. People would mention it in hushed tones, some with admiration, some with discomfort. "Did you hear what Rebecca did to David?" "She destroyed him." The reactions varied. Some people thought she'd been too harsh, that she could have just divorced him quietly. Others, particularly women who'd been through similar betrayals, thought she was a hero. Rebecca didn't care about either opinion. She'd done what she needed to do to reclaim her life and her dignity. That was all that mattered. 2 years after the divorce, Rebecca was at a work event when a young associate, a woman in her late 20s, approached her nervously. "Ms. Miller," she said, "can I ask you something personal?" Rebecca nodded. The woman took a deep breath. "I've heard the stories about your divorce, about how you handled everything. My boyfriend, I think he's cheating on me, but I don't have proof and I don't know what to do." Rebecca looked at this young woman, seeing herself years ago, uncertain and afraid. She put her hand on the woman's shoulder. First, she said, "Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, investigate. Second, document everything. Third, don't confront until you have irrefutable proof. And fourth, remember that you deserve better than someone who lies to you." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Those moments, those conversations, gave Rebecca a sense of purpose beyond her career. She wasn't just a successful attorney anymore. She was someone who'd survived betrayal and come out stronger, someone who could help others do the same. It didn't erase what had happened to her. Nothing could. But it gave meaning to the pain. It transformed her worst experience into something that could help others, and that felt like its own kind of justice. Rebecca's transformation after the divorce became more than just personal healing. She started writing about her experience as a way to process everything. She filled journals with her thoughts, the lessons she'd learned. She wrote about the red flags she'd missed, the ways David had manipulated her, the strategies she'd used to gather evidence. These journals became a guide for anyone going through similar circumstances. Her therapist encouraged her to turn these writings into something more formal. "You have valuable insights," her therapist said. "Your experience could help many people." Rebecca was hesitant. She didn't want to be known as the woman who got cheated on, even if she'd won. But the more women who reached out, the more she realized her story could serve a purpose. She started a blog, anonymous at first, detailing strategies she'd used. The blog exploded. Within 3 months, she had 50,000 followers. Women from all over were reading her posts, thanking her, sharing their stories. The blog led to speaking opportunities. Women's organizations, legal conferences, even corporate HR wanted her to speak about recognizing manipulation and protecting yourself legally in divorce. Rebecca agreed to some, always careful to maintain her professional reputation. But her message was powerful. She talked about financial abuse accompanying emotional abuse, the importance of having your own accounts. She talked about documentation, keeping records, building a case before confrontation. She talked about knowing your worth. At one speaking engagement, a woman in the audience stood up during questions. Her voice shook. "My husband has been telling me I'm crazy for thinking he's having an affair," she said. "He makes me feel like I'm losing my mind, but I know something is wrong. I just don't know how to prove it." Rebecca looked at her directly. "You're not crazy," she said firmly. "Gaslighting is abuse. Trust yourself. Start documenting everything quietly. Times, dates, inconsistencies. Check phone records if you have access. Consider hiring a private investigator. But most importantly, start preparing. Financially, make sure you have access to your own money, copies of all financial documents, and a good attorney on standby." The room erupted in applause. After the event, at least a dozen women lined up to talk to Rebecca privately. Rebecca also became involved with a nonprofit organization that helped women escape abusive relationships. While her situation hadn't involved physical abuse, she understood the psychological warfare that kept women trapped. She volunteered her legal services pro bono, helping women navigate divorces and restraining orders. She set up a fund using some of the money she'd won from David to help women who couldn't afford private investigators or top-tier attorneys. "If you're trying to leave an abusive relationship," she'd say, "you shouldn't have to do it without resources." She funded consultations with private investigators, paid for forensic accountants to uncover hidden assets, covered retainer fees for attorneys. In her first year of running this fund, she helped 32 women successfully divorce their abusive partners and secure fair settlements. The work was emotionally draining, but deeply fulfilling. Every woman she helped felt like a small victory. One woman, Maria, had been married to a man who'd isolated her from her family and controlled every penny. With Rebecca's help, Maria hired a forensic accountant who discovered her husband had been hiding money in offshore accounts. The divorce settlement gave Maria enough to start over. She sent Rebecca a card months later with a photo of herself and her children in their new apartment. "You saved our lives," the card said. "We're free because of you." Rebecca kept that card on her desk, but Rebecca's journey wasn't without setbacks. There were days when the weight of these stories felt crushing. She'd sit in meetings with women recounting abuse and feel her own trauma resurfacing. The nightmares came back sometimes, dreams where she was still with David, still being gaslit, still feeling powerless. Her therapist helped her work through these episodes, reminding her that healing isn't linear. Rebecca learned to set boundaries, to take breaks when needed, to not take on more than she could handle emotionally. She also learned to forgive herself for the time she'd stayed, for the red flags she'd ignored. That was perhaps the hardest part of her healing. She'd spent so long being angry at David, but underneath was anger at herself. How could she, a smart, successful attorney, have been so blind? Her therapist helped her reframe these questions. "You weren't blind," her therapist said. "You were in love with someone who lied expertly. He was a master manipulator. That's not your fault." It took time, but eventually Rebecca believed it. She stopped blaming herself and placed the blame where it belonged, on David's shoulders. 3 years post-divorce, Rebecca went on her first serious date since David. His name was Michael, a fellow attorney she'd known casually for years. He was divorced, too, understood the complications of rebuilding trust. Their first date was coffee that turned into a 4-hour conversation. Michael was kind, thoughtful, genuinely interested in her thoughts. He didn't interrupt her, didn't mansplain, didn't try to dominate the conversation. It was refreshing and a little scary. Rebecca had grown so accustomed to being on guard that genuine kindness felt suspicious. They dated slowly, cautiously. Rebecca was upfront about her past, about David, about her trust issues. Michael listened without judgment. "I get it," he said. "My ex-wife cheated on me with my business partner. I know what it's like to have your world implode. Take all the time you need." And he meant it. He never pushed for more than she was ready to give. He respected her boundaries. He showed up consistently, did what he said he'd do, never gave her reason to doubt him. Slowly, Rebecca allowed herself to trust again. 6 months into their relationship, Michael met Rebecca's parents. Her mother pulled her aside while Michael was helping her father in the garage. "This one's different," her mother said. "You can see it in how he looks at you, like you're an equal, not a possession." Rebecca smiled. "I know, Mom. I'm taking it slow, but yeah, he's different." Her mother hugged her. "You deserve wonderful." And maybe Rebecca was starting to believe that too. The relationship with Michael wasn't perfect. They had disagreements, moments of misunderstanding, times when Rebecca's trauma responses kicked in and she pulled away. But the difference was, they talked through it. Michael never got defensive when she expressed concerns. He never made her feel crazy for having trust issues. He understood that loving someone who'd been deeply betrayed meant being patient, being consistent, being willing to prove yourself over and over, and he was willing to do that work. A year into their relationship, Rebecca and Michael took a trip together to Paris. Walking along the Seine one evening, Michael turned to her and said, "I love you, Rebecca. I love your strength, your intelligence, your compassion. I love who you are." Rebecca felt tears in her eyes. With David, those words had felt like manipulation. With Michael, it felt like truth. "I love you too," she said. It was terrifying and wonderful, opening her heart again after it had been so thoroughly broken. But standing there in Paris with a man who valued and respected her, Rebecca felt hope for the future. Today, Rebecca Miller is 41 years old. She's a partner at her law firm, one of the most respected corporate attorneys in Chicago. She lives in her beautiful townhouse in Gold Coast, the one she fought for and won. She travels regularly, pursuing the adventures she'd put on hold during her marriage. She has strong friendships, a close relationship with her family, and a life built entirely on her own terms. She dates occasionally, but she's in no rush. She's learned to be happy, alone. 2, find fulfillment in her work and her friendships, to not need a partner to feel complete. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Rebecca thinks about that phone call from Madison, the one that changed everything. She thinks about the split-second decision to play along, to pretend she knew, to use Madison's confession to destroy David. It was the best decision she ever made, not because of the money, though the financial security is nice, not because of the revenge, though watching David lose everything was satisfying, but because it gave her back her power. For months, David had controlled the narrative, controlled her reality, made her question herself. In that phone call, she took control back, and she never let it go again. The final chapter of this story isn't about David at all. It's about Rebecca, about a woman who was betrayed and manipulated and gaslit, but who refused to be a victim, who used her intelligence, her legal training, her strategic thinking to fight back, who made sure the man who hurt her faced real consequences, who rebuilt her life into something better than it was before. That's the story. That's the justice. Not just that David lost everything, though he did, but that Rebecca won everything. Her peace, her power, her happiness, her life. And nobody, not David, not Madison, not anyone, could ever take that away from her again. She made sure of it. And that's the sweetest revenge of all. Living well, living free, living on your own terms after someone tried to destroy you. Thank you for watching this story. If you found it powerful or helpful, please subscribe to this channel. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. And remember, if you're going through something similar, you're stronger than you know. You deserve better than betrayal. And justice, real justice, is absolutely possible. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.